I never thought a family dinner could change my entire life. My name is Brenda, and I had just come off a long week at work when I sat down at my parents' dining table in Boise. It should have been a quiet Sunday meal, the kind where everyone talks about their week and then goes home. Instead, my mother set her fork down, looked directly at me, and told me I needed to pay off my sister's debt. She said it calmly, like she was asking me to pass the salt, as if it was already decided. As if my role in this family had always been to step in, fix things, and stay quiet about it. I remember staring at her then, at the others at the table. No one looked surprised. No one questioned it. It was as if they had discussed this before I arrived and agreed I would simply comply. They did not ask how my own life was going. They did not ask whether I could actually afford it. They did not even explain how or why the debt existed. They just assumed I would cover it because I always had. That was the moment something in me clicked. I looked up, kept my voice steady, and said the words that froze the room. If you don't work, you don't eat. No one spoke for several seconds. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. If you've ever felt like family loyalty was weighed against money, stay with me until the end. You'll understand why I made the choice I did. And don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments. Someone out there may need to know they aren't alone. To understand why I reacted the way I did, we need to go back to the moment I left home after high school. I moved out earlier than most people I knew, not because I was eager for independence in a romantic or idealistic way, but because staying in that house meant accepting a role I had never agreed to play. I did not want to be the reliable one, the replacement parent, the backup plan, the safety net that was treated more like an obligation than a person. I went straight into full-time work, choosing a position as a logistics coordinator for a warehouse near the industrial district of Boise. It was not glamorous, and no one would ever pretend it was. I spent most days on my feet coordinating inventory schedules, delivery routes, freight paperwork, and supply issues that never seemed to end. The work was repetitive and sometimes drained every bit of energy I had, yet it was also the first thing in my life that felt like mine. No one handed it to me. No one stepped in to clean up after me. No one could claim any part of it belonged to them. My goal was clear from the beginning. I wanted a place of my own. Not just a rental. Not just a room in someone else's home. A space I could close the door to and know that whatever was inside belonged to me. I began saving immediately, setting aside whatever I could spare. Most months that meant skipping dinners out, wearing the same coat winter after winter, and ignoring the pressure to upgrade or show signs of financial progress to impress anyone. I was not interested in performing success. I was interested in earning stability. At home, things continued in their usual pattern. My younger sister Cassidy always had an easier time. She was the one who could come home late, forget responsibilities, or make impulsive decisions without anyone pressing consequences onto her shoulders. Mom would justify anything Cassidy did, insisting that she was going through something, that she needed time, that I should understand and be patient. I rarely argued. I simply learned that in that house, accountability was optional for some people and expected in silence from others. While I was working long hours and saving every dollar that did not need to be spent on survival, Cassidy was experimenting with hobbies, jobs, relationships, and dramatic reinventions of herself. She could quit one job and start another without worry because there was always a soft landing. I did not have one. I became familiar with the feeling of being self-reliant in a way that is both empowering and isolating. When you learn that no help is coming, you stop asking for it. It took years before I had enough for a down payment on a small studio apartment near downtown. I remember signing the papers, holding the keys, and standing in the center of the empty room. The walls were bare, the appliances were basic, and the flooring had scuff marks that could not be sanded out, but it was mine. Every hour I had worked, every paycheck I had stretched, every quiet sacrifice I had made, lived inside that space. I did not decorate it immediately. I simply stood there and breathed. That apartment represented more than living space. It was proof that I had built something without borrowing from anyone else. It was proof that I did not owe my life to the expectations of others. It was the first time I felt the ground beneath me was solid. And that is why, when my family later spoke about it as if it were nothing more than a solution to someone else's mistakes, something in me hardened. They saw a resource. I saw the cost of everything I had endured to claim my own life. The distance between those two views explains everything that came after. 1 year earlier, everything began to crack. I did not notice it at first, because the changes did not happen in one dramatic moment. They came quietly through small choices habits that built upon each other until the shape of her life had shifted entirely. Cassidy had always cared about how others viewed her, but that year it began to consume her. Social media was the center of her world. The photos, the comments, the invitations to events that looked glamorous but cost far more than she could afford. She wanted to be seen as someone enviable, someone admired, someone who seemed to live without limits. She started buying clothes that she could not pay for upfront using buy now, pay later apps that made spending feel painless. Each pair of shoes, each new coat, each series of salon visits looked like small individual indulgences, but when placed together, they formed a financial pattern that could not sustain itself. I would see pictures of her with cocktails in lounges downtown, or weekend trips with friends who lived just as impulsively. The images always looked polished and perfect, but I understood enough about life to recognize when something was being constructed only for the camera. Mom and Dad seemed enchanted by the illusion as well. They spoke about Cassidy as though her lifestyle meant she was thriving. They told relatives that she was doing well, building connections, living freely. They preferred that story over reality because it was easier to believe that everything was okay. When bills started arriving, Mom quietly took them from the mailbox before I could see them during visits. When credit card balances increased, Dad paid the minimum amount and told Cassidy to be more careful next time. They were trying to protect her, or perhaps protect themselves from acknowledging that they had encouraged her to think that consequences were optional. The first time I realized the situation was serious was when Cassidy called me late in the evening, asking if I could send her money immediately. She said she needed to cover rent because her paycheck had been short and she would pay me back within the week. I listened, and I felt the old instinct to help the part of me that had learned to solve problems quietly so no one else would be uncomfortable. I asked her why this was happening, and her explanation was shallow and vague. It did not contain accountability. It did not contain awareness. It sounded like a pattern, not an accident. I told her that I could not give her money. I did not raise my voice. I did not criticize her. I simply said that I had worked too hard to maintain my own stability and I could not jeopardize it. There was silence on the phone. It was not the silence of understanding. It was the silence of disbelief, as if she had approached a familiar door and found it locked for the first time. She said she thought I would understand, and I replied that I did understand, which was exactly why I could not help. After that, the distance grew. Cassidy stopped speaking to me with warmth. Mom began calling to suggest that I could have handled the situation more gently. Dad avoided discussing it at all. The house did not say the words, but it carried the message clearly. I had stepped outside the role they had assigned to me. I was no longer the one who absorbed the impact of everyone else's choices. And once a home expects you to sacrifice yourself for the comfort of others, choosing not to do so is treated as betrayal. I did not apologize. I lived my life. The crack had already formed. One weekend afternoon, Mom told me that I needed to come to my Aunt Marlene's house. The way she said it was calm and almost warm, but there was a firmness beneath it that made refusal pointless. I drove across town with a quiet awareness that whatever waited there would not be a conversation as much as a declaration. Marlene lived in a wide, single-story house with an extended dining room that always felt staged, like a photograph in a real estate magazine, rather than a space where people truly lived. When I walked in, the long dining table was already set, though no food was being served, and the chairs were filled as if everyone had been waiting for me to take the last open seat. Mom sat upright near the end of the table with her hands resting together in a still and deliberate pose. Dad was beside her with his eyes lowered and his shoulders held tightly, as though he had rehearsed silence rather than speech. Cassidy sat across from me. Her posture had the sag of exhaustion, yet her face was composed carefully with makeup placed to disguise the strain she could not completely hide. Marlene stood near the counter pouring tea into matching cups, making slow, measured movements that suggested she intended to project control, patience, and authority. No one spoke for several long moments, and the silence felt like the room itself was leaning inward, waiting to press upon me. When Mom finally began, her tone was soft, but unmistakably directive. She spoke about family loyalty, shared responsibility, and the idea that we are defined by how we show up for each other in difficult times. She said that Cassidy was in trouble and that I was in a position to help, which meant that I should help, as though capacity alone created obligation. She used phrases like "we take care of our own" and "this is what family means," but each phrase was shaped to imply that my refusal would be an act of betrayal. Cassidy's eyes filled with tears while Mom spoke, yet she did not address me directly, nor did she speak any acknowledgement of her own choices. Her tears fell quietly, but there was intention behind the way she bowed her head and held her breath, as if waiting for someone to cradle her from the consequences she had created. I recognized the pattern as familiar. It was the same choreography she had relied on many times across our lives, one that often resulted in others stepping between her and accountability. I responded carefully. I said that I respected the love this family held for one another, but I had spent years building a life that relied on stability and grounded discipline, and I would not jeopardize that foundation by taking on debt that I did not create. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my expression. I simply stated the boundary that I had already made peace with. The room reacted not with outbursts, but with a tension so dense it felt almost physical. Dad finally spoke in a voice that was quiet, but weighted. He said that families should not have to ask twice for help. He said that if the situation were reversed, Cassidy would do the same for me. The words hovered in the space between us with the heavy awareness that they were not true. Everyone in the room knew it. Yet he continued holding to the story that was more comfortable than reality. Marlene took her seat, then placing her folded hands upon the table and said in a tone that sought neutrality that there were legal avenues for situations like this. She said that the court could consider shared obligation if the family presented the matter as a collective responsibility. She described it not as pressure but as procedure, as if involving the legal system was simply the next reasonable step when persuasion failed. In that moment, I understood that this meeting had not been arranged to discuss anything. It had been arranged to inform me of what would come if I did not comply. So I told them no again with steadiness rather than emotion. The room stilled in a way that made it unmistakably clear that something foundational had shifted and nothing would return to what it had been before. A few weeks later, the letter from the court arrived at my apartment door. It was placed carefully on the doormat as if whoever delivered it wanted to make sure I would not overlook it. The envelope was plain, yet something about its weight felt deliberate, almost heavy. I stood there holding it for longer than I should have, the quiet in my entryway becoming an echo of something in my chest that I did not want to acknowledge. I knew exactly what this was before opening it. The letter stated that I was required to appear for a civil hearing. It explained that my parents were asserting that I held an obligation to contribute financially in what they described as a matter of family duty. They claimed that because they had raised me, supported me, and provided for me, I now owed them compensation in the form of assisting my sister with her debt. The language in the letter was formal, but the intention underneath was painfully familiar. It was not law. It was guilt wrapped in legal terminology. I sat on my couch for several minutes after reading, I did not cry or panic. I only felt something dull begin to settle inside me, something like realization. My parents were not simply asking anymore. They were willing to use the legal system to enforce their version of family roles. They had chosen a narrative that painted me as ungrateful and selfish for protecting what I had worked for. I understood then that the conflict was no longer emotional alone. It had become procedural. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. Her name was Brooke Hayes, and she was recommended by a colleague who had gone through a difficult inheritance dispute the previous year. When I walked into her office, the walls were lined with framed university degrees and case outcomes, yet the space did not feel intimidating. Brooke had a presence that was steady, like someone who understood confrontation without ever needing to raise volume or posture for control. I explained the situation in clear terms, careful not to dramatize. She listened without interrupting. Only after I finished did she speak. She told me that in the United States, parents cannot demand repayment for the ordinary costs of raising a child. They cannot convert emotional or parental investment into a legal debt. She said that the argument my parents were making would not hold in court unless there had been a written contract stating that I had agreed to take responsibility for my sister's finances, which, of course, did not exist. Her explanation did not feel triumphant. It felt clarifying. The law was on my side, yet that did not erase the fact that my parents had chosen to move against me publicly. I asked Brooke what would happen next. She said we would respond formally, appear at the hearing, and present documentation that my finances were independent and that no shared obligation existed. Her tone remained calm as she spoke, but there was something firm beneath her words. She had seen families fracture in conference rooms just like this. That evening, I met my close friend Nate at a small cafe near my apartment. I told him everything from the letter to the meeting with Brooke. He did not interrupt or offer advice immediately. He let the silence exist without trying to erase it. When he finally spoke, he asked me one question. He asked whether I felt sorrow, anger, or resignation. I realized I did not know the answer. The emotion was not sharp. It was something broad and slow, like a tide moving in without asking permission. I told him I felt like I had been pushed out of a house I had never actually been invited to live in. He nodded, not to agree, but to show he understood the shape of the feeling. I walked home with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The hearing was no longer the central point. The break happened earlier. The courtroom would only make it official. The morning of the hearing settled over Boise in a heavy gray quiet that seemed to press against the windows of my car as I drove downtown. I parked in the public lot beside the courthouse and sat for a brief moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, letting my breathing steady, reminding myself that I had already lived through the hardest parts of this, and that my presence in this room today was not about victory, but about refusing to abandon myself. When I walked inside, Cassidy was sitting between Mom and Dad near the hallway outside the courtroom. She was dressed carefully, her hair curled, makeup soft, trying to look small and overwhelmed rather than responsible for the situation that had brought us here. Mom glanced at me without speaking, with an expression that suggested I had already disappointed her simply by showing up without surrender. Dad kept his eyes forward, as though looking at me directly might force him to acknowledge the reason we were all standing in that building. My attorney, Brooke Hayes, was waiting near the bench seating. This was the first time I had seen her in a setting like this. She stood straight, calm, with the practiced stillness of someone who understood systems rather than emotions. When she spoke to me, her tone was low, and even reminding me that this was a hearing for clarification and not a trial for guilt. I nodded, letting her presence ground me. Inside the courtroom, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. The judge took his seat with an air of pragmatic fatigue, the kind that comes from seeing too many families fracture in slow motion. When Mom began to speak, her voice trembled, but in a rehearsed way, leaning heavily on sentiment rather than fact. She talked about the love she had poured into raising two daughters, about sacrifices made, about how family should support family when one of them stumbles. She framed repayment of Cassidy's debt as a gesture of loyalty rather than a financial obligation, as though morality could be reshaped by expectation alone. Cassidy followed her voice softer, insisting she had no other options, that she had tried, that the world had simply been too heavy. She did not say she had ignored warnings, disregarded budgets, or treated credit like air. Her words asked for sympathy without accountability, a familiar pattern. When it was my turn, I did not raise my voice, or let emotion twist the edges of my sentences. I stated that I cared about my family, but that caring did not require erasing my own boundaries. I explained that I had worked for what I had, that I could not solve another adult's choices, and that love was not measured by the size of a check written to fix someone else's mistakes. The courtroom held a stillness that did not feel hostile, only observant. Then Brooke spoke. Her explanation was clear without being harsh. She outlined the legal principle that raising a child is a responsibility parents choose, not a debt that child owes in adulthood. She clarified that personal financial decisions made by one adult cannot be transferred to another simply because they share a last name. Her tone allowed no confusion or emotional redirection. The judge ruled accordingly. The petition was denied. Cassidy's debt remained her own. The legal fees and court costs fell to the filing party. The room did not erupt. It simply sank into a silence that tasted like cold air. No one looked at me as we left the courtroom. I walked out into the gray morning, and for the first time the sky did not feel heavy. A few months passed after the hearing, and the texture of everyday life changed in ways that were quiet but undeniable. The days did not unfold with dramatic revelations or confrontations. Instead, consequences settled into place the same way winter frost forms on a window, slow and certain, reshaping everything it touches. Cassidy took a job at a retail store on the edge of town, one of those chain locations where bright fluorescent lights make everything look flatter and a little harsher. The work schedule was unpredictable, and the pay was low enough that each paycheck seemed to dissolve the moment it arrived. She posted less online. The glossy photographs of weekend brunches, spontaneous trips, and carefully curated outfits faded, replaced by occasional pictures of break room coffee or tired eyes in a car parking lot. She was not dramatic about it. She simply learned that bills do not care about pride or aesthetic. Life has a way of teaching that lesson without raising its voice. Mom and Dad felt the impact in a different way. Their credit score dropped sharply after the legal fees and the unpaid revolving balances caught up with them. They had to move out of the house where we celebrated every birthday and holiday, the one with the peeling paint on the back porch, but the warm kitchen where so many dinners took place. They rented a smaller place on the outskirts of Boise, a place with thin walls and beige carpeting that always looked tired no matter how much light touched it. The move was quiet. They did not announce it to extended family. They simply disappeared from the neighborhood. There was no dramatic argument or final exchange of accusations. Silence arrived slowly. Days without messages became weeks, then months. I changed the tone of my phone notifications so I would not flinch if their names appeared, although they rarely did. Boundaries, when kept, do not always look heroic. Sometimes they look like space distance, ordinary quiet. I did not block them. I simply stopped stepping forward to fill the gaps. And they did not step forward either. In that space, my life steadied. I continued working at the logistics center not because it was a dream job but because it supported the life I built. I began attending evening classes at the local community college, exploring supply chain management more formally. I rearranged the furniture in my apartment, added a bookshelf, bought a plant that needed more care than the cactus I had before. These were not extravagant changes. They were choices that affirmed that the life I had was mine, shaped by effort rather than expectation or obligation. Sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings I walked through the farmers market downtown. I would see families talking, children pulling at sleeves, the ordinary chaos of connection. There was a time when watching families like that made me feel the familiar sting of what I wanted mine to be. Now it felt like observing something separate, not painful and not enviable, simply separate. Cassidy learned to adjust to the reality of supporting herself. Mom and Dad learned that expectations do not rewrite responsibility. And I learned that distance can be a form of love for oneself, a protection that does not seek to punish others, but simply refuses to abandon the self to preserve an image of family that never truly existed. Stability did not arrive with celebration or any sense of triumph. It appeared in the quiet routines that filled my days, in the steady rhythm of work, rest, and the calm space I allowed myself to protect. Life moved forward without dramatic closure, without reconciliation, without a return to the way things were, and that quiet continuation became its own form of peace. Now, looking back, I understand something that felt impossible to grasp when I was still inside the situation. I once believed that family ties inherently demanded sacrifice and unquestioned loyalty, as though love was proven through how much of myself I could give away before I finally ran out. I thought that saying no, drawing a boundary, or choosing my own path meant turning my back on the people who raised me. Only after everything unfolded did I realize that love without autonomy is not love, and loyalty that destroys you is not devotion, it is surrender. The distance I maintain now is not rooted in resentment, but in clarity about what allows me to remain whole. There are moments when I remember quiet evenings in that house, memories where laughter still lived, and part of me wonders if things could have been different. Yet even in those recollections, I know that affection cannot erase the expectation of debt that was placed on me. True connection cannot grow where obligation replaces care. I moved forward not to prove anything, not to punish anyone, but to preserve the ability to stand in my own life without being consumed by the expectations of others. Peace for me did not arrive loudly. It settled slowly in the rhythm of my days, in the steadiness of work I chose, and in the space I now allow myself to live without guilt. I learned that responsibility for oneself is not selfishness, and financial independence is not a betrayal of family. I learned that I do not have to diminish myself to be considered loving, nor do I need to rescue others from the consequences of their choices. Boundaries are not walls blocking love, but the framework that keeps love healthy, honest, and alive. A relationship that demands the sacrifice of dignity is not a relationship worth holding. Thank you for staying with my story until the end. If you have experienced something similar, or if you have thoughts about family responsibility or boundaries, I would truly value hearing your perspective. Your experiences and reflections matter here. Share your voice in the comments below, and let's talk about what healthy love really looks like.